Propaganda Girls is the story of 4 women who worked for the OSS during World War II for the morale operations department, and that meant they were in charge of creating what was known as black propaganda aimed at the enemy, both the civilian and the military populations, as well as the occupied populations like in China and Burma. Um, and so I the 4 women, I knew I wanted, Betty McDonald, who, has wrote books about her experience in the OSS. I knew I wanted Barbara Zuska-Lowers, who was based in Europe. She was Czech-born, she's enlisted in the army, and then got recruited for morale operations. And I knew I wanted Marlene Dietrich because she wasn't technically part of the OSS, but she was involved in a lot of she toured with the USO to army bases and throughout Europe, during the war, and she recorded songs that would be beamed into Germany, um where she tweaked the lyrics of these songs to make them a little bit more depressing than they otherwise would, like Lily Marlene. And she th- there was I don't haven't heard this song, but her version of the song, but she also recorded the Surrey with the Fringe on top from Oklahoma. And I'm not aware of how she tweaked that, but the fourth woman, I knew I wanted the women in different locations, but I also knew I wanted a woman in DC, in the States, because a lot of the books, as you probably know from your own reading, a lot of the books about women in World War II, they're about women spies and uh, enlistees who were on the front lines, and they faced danger, and I wanted to talk about a woman, include a woman who was based in the States, because I hadn't read about any women who were based at the OSS or just based in DC, other than, the Rosie the Riveters and the secretaries who were recruited in droves during the war. And so I found a woman named Jane Smith Hutton, who was married to a naval attaché, and she worked for the OSS in morale operations, and she created a lot of the literature that was distributed in these MO operations. Um, Her story was really interesting, and I mean, the reason why I picked those 4 women was because I needed research. I needed sufficient research about them. I needed their OSS personnel files. I needed to know the details of what they had created. I needed to know their backstories. Jane was really interesting because she and her husband were stationed in Tokyo at the US Embassy for Pearl Harbor. They were interned in the embassy for 6 months, for 6 or 7 months after Pearl Harbor, and so that was a really interesting story, and that drove her narrative in wanting to get even with the Japanese. And similarly, Betty was a newspaper reporter in Honolulu, and for during Pearl Harbor. So she had her own story. And all these women, as you pointed out earlier, they did not want to plant victory gardens. They did not want to wrap gauze bandages to help. They bought war bonds, of course, and Marlena was very active in selling war bonds, but they wanted to be where the action was. They wanted 3 of the 4 wanted to be overseas. And Jane, based in DC, wanted to, you know, do something. What they all had in common too is all spoke a foreign language. Zuzka spoke 5 different languages. So that's how I picked the women. And There was a little bit of overlap between them, but not much, and that was an initial hesitation from one publisher why they turned down the book, because they wanted it to be like Hidden Figures where the women all work together, 24/7 in the same or, the whole workday in the same location, but that would have been impossible. That was for me, it was impossible to find, and also I wanted the different geographic spread. So, that's how the book came about. I think I first found out about the OSS and the MO and the women when I was, researching the book, The Dogs of War. I did a few books on military working dogs, and I think I was just again, it's hard to trace to trace the breadcrumbs back to the initial source, but I think that I was reading books on military working dogs during how they were used during World War II, and I stumbled on the MO Morale Operations Division and these women, and it just kind of, ballooned from there. Oh, they each did so many things. I mean, Marlena did sang the songs. That was her contribution, essentially. Zuzka was very intriguing because she also, served because of her gift for languages, she also served as an interrogator of POWs. She was based in, Rome, and so what she did is she would interrogate the POWs and then get ideas for MO pamphlets and letters from that, and so she, interviewed a young German POW once and who was not all tough and rough, and she asked him, what do you most miss?" And he or about the war, about being a soldier, and he says, "I worry that my some German is screwing my girl back home." And so what Zuzka did is she took that germ of an idea and created something called the League of Lonely War Women, where she created this totally fake campaign that was purported to be from German women who miss their men and they want to support the war effort. So they're going to, if you, they're going to look for the bedraggled German soldiers wandering through the town square and take them home, give them a good meal, screw his brains out, and then let him go in the morning, and that's the war duty. That's how they're pulling their war duty, and and it was totally fake. And what Zuzka put in the pamphlet was to cut out this little heart and pin it to your army uniform, and that's a sign that the women in the town will come and take you home, basically. And so that story, even though it was fake, somebody picked up on it, and I believe either the Washington Post or I think it was the Washington Post actually ran a story on it. And so there was that. Betty, um, actually, Zuzka worked in the Rome office with the cartoonist who would become Saul Steinberg, who would later become a very famous New Yorker cartoonist, and together they came up with the idea to create toilet paper with Hitler's face on it. And so they printed up, and again, the supplies were so low, so what they did is they got really rough paper, which was rolls of toilet paper, used at the time, because of course everything was going towards the war effort, and they pried up linoleum blocks from the floor of tiles from the floor of the OSS office in Rome, and they carved out Hitler's face and used, I don't know what they used for ink, but they printed his face on on the toilet paper with the words "use this side" in German, and then their POWs would then take the rolls and put them in the latrines for the German soldiers in the countryside. I mean, those were my 2 favorite examples, and there were a lot of other great examples in the book as well. Black propaganda is usually employed towards the end of the war when the losing side is starting to lose heart. Again, both the civilians and the military personnel. And so they were the 4 women were really active for about the last 18 months of the war, and because Betty was based in, the Pacific Theater, uh her service ended in late in mid-August of 1945, and Zuzka's, I believe, um, ended in the middle of June, you know, so of 1945, and along with, Zuzka's service. So, but it's you don't use black propaganda in the beginning of the war because everybody's all, each side is both are both revved up about the war, and they think they're gonna win, and so that's why it's brought in towards the end. If I had only one resource to pick, it would be newspapers.com, because I could also look up, um, newspapers.com doesn't include military newspapers and records, but it's also tied into Ancestry. So I could find their life events and that were written up, birth notices, hobbies, like Jane Smith Hutton was involved in the DAR in San Diego, in after the war for years after the war. But in this case, my gold mine was the National Archives because the OSS records were declassified. I don't know the exact date, 25 years ago. And so I really love getting down and dirty into holding those papers in my hands. But I also realized it wasn't a great use of my time because I didn't know what to look for. And there are freelance archivists who work for clients all over the world. They're full-time at the National Archives. In this case, the OSS records are held in College Park, Maryland, and so I could tell them, "Okay, I want whatever you can pull on the personnel files for all the women, but also the files for the operations they were involved in, like Operation Marigold, Operation Muzak, which was Marlena's operation, and so the personnel files were gold because or platinum because without them, I wouldn't have found the, uh, evidence of such sexism and prejudice against the women and how they were not promoted and how they had to fight for a promotion, how they had to fight for raises. The memos were tucked in the files. And so for this book in particular, I really relied heavily on these files. In fact, I hired 2 different archivists a couple of years apart, and some of the stuff they pulled was identical, but each one pulled files that the other one hadn't pulled, and so that helped to broaden my perspective and broaden their stories in the book.